Here's a live look at what's happening right now on Capitol Hill in Washington. The CEO of Boeing, there he is, Dennis Muilenburg, in the hot seat, you might say, before a U.S. Senate committee. So he's getting grilled over what happened with 2 crashes within the span of 1 year. So this Q&A coming from senators. Tomorrow he will face members of the House. The Boeing 737 MAX is the kind of plane that was involved in those 2 crashes. In all, 346 people were killed, including 18 Canadians. I can tell you that worldwide, those MAX aircraft remain grounded following the incidents. And right off the top of his opening statement, this man, Dennis Muilenburg, said he was sorry about it. Laura McQuillan tracking the story. Beyond that, he comes out, mea culpa, sorry. What does he say?
That's right. So he wanted to explain a few things about the thinking behind the design and the certification of the plane, which is where the questions have focused so far. And it's really been that anti-stall system we've spoken about so much that made these planes nosedive, which is what led them to crash in the first place. Now, that system is known as MCAS. It relied on a single sensor to be triggered, and we know that pilots weren't trained. They didn't even know it existed on planes. So that's one of the questions that's been put to him today. And Muilenburg, in his opening statement, wanted to describe the changes they're making to that system to give lawmakers and the public confidence about these planes. Here's what he said about that.
We've enhanced MCAS in 3 ways. First, it will now compare information from both sensors instead of one before activating. Second, MCAS will only activate a single time. And third, MCAS will never provide more input than a pilot can counteract using the control column alone. Pilots will also continue to have the ability to override MCAS at any time.
So you heard Muilenburg there trying to convince lawmakers that it's going to be a safe system when it gets back in the sky. He said there have been more than 800 test flights so far. He himself has flown on a couple of them as well.
And there have been some big exchanges already. I mentioned this is day 1 of 2 days of testimony there in Washington for Mr. Muilenburg. What's happened that you've caught that sort of feisty testiness?
So part of that is the relationship between Boeing and the Federal Aviation Authority, whether it's had enough oversight of the company and that cozy relationship that they seem to have formed. Part of the issue there centres on some leaked messages that recently came out, instant messages and emails from a former test pilot for Boeing, in which he said he'd been trying to Jedi mind trick regulators about the training that pilots would need. Now, the same test pilot had flagged issues with a simulator using that MCAS system 2 years before that first flight, but nothing seems to have happened there. Those messages were withheld from regulators until earlier this year and delayed and being released after that. Now, the Senate Commerce Committee's chair, Roger Wicker, actually put some questions about that to Muilenburg, and here's how the exchange went over those messages.
When were you made aware of the existence of the November 2016 messages?
As I recall, I believe it was prior to the second crash earlier this year.
Can you see that this raises much concern about the level of coziness between Boeing personnel and FAA regulators?
I can tell you that the comments, the values, the approaches that are described in those emails are counter to our values.
So lawmakers are really pressing Muilenburg hard, not just on that certification, but really how Boeing operates, what its design involves, what its certification pushes involve as well. Of course, one big day of testimony before the Senate today. He's heading to the House tomorrow as well to be grilled again there. All of this as Boeing hopes to get these planes back in the sky this very year, but it needs approval from the Federal Aviation Authority to do that. So they're going to be looking closely at that relationship throughout these hearings, whether that's going to happen or not.
Thank you, Laura.
You're welcome.
Let's stick with this story because it's, we all get on planes, right? So let's find out more about it. Keith Mackey is a former airline captain. He's also the president of Mackey International. It's an aviation consulting firm specializing in safety and risk management. And our chase team has reached Keith in Ocala, Florida. Great to have you on the program again, Keith, because I know you always give me the goods straight from the heart. I want to know what you think about Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg. He gets before the Senate committee. He apologizes in his opening statement to family members of victims. He says, we know we made mistakes. We know we got some things wrong. We own it and we are fixing them. What do you make of that?
Well, that's what he has to do. He has to be honest. He has to get the confidence of the regulators and of the public back before the airplane will be successful again.
And is it good enough, though?
Well, I think when the airplanes return to service, it will be fine. I think the things that he mentioned that were wrong with the MCAS system, the 3 items that have been corrected, will certainly solve the problem. This has been accomplished months ago, but the politics and the regulatory agencies that have to deal with this and approve it, no one wants to be the first one forward. No one wants to say, yeah, it's fine, we accept it, therefore everyone else should. So I think that's why it's taking so long. Everyone has to cover themselves.
Yes, the CYA kind of syndrome. These planes are still grounded, as you know, worldwide, Keith. It's an issue of trust on 2 fronts. Boeing has to gain the confidence of the airlines, so they will take their planes back up, and their pilots as well. And it also has to gain the trust of people like me, passengers who pay money, get a ticket, and then ask, what kind of plane is it? And we have to feel comfortable. What's the harder of those 2?
You're exactly correct. The problem is going to be getting people to ride on the airplane initially. Some people are just going to refuse to ride on a MAX for a period of time. You know, after the thing's been operating successfully for 6 or 8 months, I think confidence will begin to return. But we're going to almost have to have 2 schedules, I think. Those that use a MAX and those that use the standard 737, so that people can make an informed decision. Because I think otherwise a lot of people would arrive at the airport and find it was a MAX and decide not to go. So this is a problem the airlines are going to have to deal with.
And how do you think airlines will deal with it?
By doing something similar to that, something sort of a dual schedule type thing where certain flights are always run with a MAX and other ones are run with the conventional 737 variants.
Right, so that means my ticket prices could go up.
I doubt it. Maybe they'll go down if you ride on the MAX.
I don't even want to go there with you, Keith. I do want to ask you about the FAA, though, the Federal Aviation Administration. We know it came under scrutiny this year. There were investigations as to whether the FAA allowed Boeing to police itself too much, to regulate itself. What are the challenges the FAA is facing in regulating, doing more of the regulation of the airline manufacturers?
Well, the FAA sets the standards. They set the rules as to how the aircraft's supposed to perform, how all the systems are supposed to operate, and it's incumbent upon the manufacturer to demonstrate to the FAA that the systems they're designing meet those criteria. And the FAA accepts their design and then supposedly monitors what's taking place. Now, in the case of the MCAS system, it seems that we haven't accepted that. It seems that Boeing, without telling the FAA, increased the authority of the system by a factor of 4 and did it upon their own without telling the FAA. So that's a problem. And I think that that's going to have to be disclosed and resolved as to how this is never going to happen again in the future.
Right. Speaking of the future, Keith, can you look ahead for me? What do you think is the best that can come out of these hearings, today's testimony and tomorrow before the House?
Well, I think he's got to clear the air. I think he's doing a pretty good job of doing that. I mean, he's got a lot of things that really can't be explained. People are just going to have to accept the fact that they're not going to happen again. And I think that Boeing has had a severe reawakening on this. Their focus is going to have to be a lot more on engineering than on the bottom line. And they're going to convince the regulators and the public that this is the case, and there are not going to be any more situations like this.
Great to have you on the program, as I said, Keith. So you take care of yourself. Thank you.
Okay, Suhana, take care.
Keith Mackey is a former airline captain and president of Mackey International, and we reached him in Ocala, Florida.